Hello there, and welcome back to the Closet Historian and back to the Carmine Gown project. Today I have the final video for you in this sort of mini-series costume situation for the Carmine Gown project, and that is, of course, how to make the hat, or how I made the hat. Of course, here I am in the past. I haven't made the hat yet, but you've seen it already if you've been following this costume closely. But I knew I wanted to make something a little bit different than the cicada gown hat that I made, or the little miniature bonnet I made for the cicada gown. You can see that video here, or that bonnet here. But today I wanted to make something a little bit larger and something that can be worn a little bit more tilted and just like a little bit more domineering of a hat, actually. And there are plenty of different Victorian styles to choose from, so I'll show you some of the inspiration images where I got the idea and sort of concept for this hat, and then we can jump on over to the Blue Pattern Table of Doom, as always, and get started. So I knew I wanted something a bit larger this time, so I was looking at larger Victorian hats, but not necessarily wide-brimmed hats. Something a little taller, I suppose. I think I'll get into wider brims and experimenting with that kind of thing if I ever enter into Edwardian costuming. But here are some different hat ideas I was seeing floating around on Pinterest, either extant photographs, obviously, or drawings from the period showing hats of the late Bustle period. And I really was taken with these taller, almost conical, I think they're sometimes called flower pot hats here on the left-hand side of the screen. And then, of course, ribbons and feathers, but I always like ribbons and feathers. And then this hat here on the left-hand side was my main inspiration for the hat I ended up making. So this is the shape that I was following quite closely, although I think mine ended up a little bit shorter than this, just because it seemed so exaggerated until when I was mocking these up in paper. And then the hats on the right-hand side of the screen here were inspiring me for the color scheme, yellow and black here. Not that surprising if you know that I like bees. That sometimes people call me bee. Yellow and black is pretty common. I really quite like this color combo, and it would match my corset, not that I'd ever wear my corset with just a hat, or vice versa. But yes, I did go ahead and try and make a mock-up for this hat. I often like to mock up hats in poster board or construction paper, and that is what I'm using here. I'm just using sheets of poster board that I already had here in the studio. So I just started kind of imagining what the shapes needed to be and started playing with paper to get the idea of what I wanted to make out of buckram and wire, like I usually use for making hats here on the channel. So I'm just cutting out different shapes, a brim, a stand, and a hat tip out of the paper to try and create a good template, and trying this hat onto my head even. And I probably could have, in the end, made this hat maybe a half-inch larger, and it would have fit a little bit better. I think I forgot how much room the materials, like the wire, was going to, and the layers of fabric were going to take up, so I could have made this a little bit larger for a perfect fit, but it still works in the end. But after I had finalized my paper pattern here, you can see I am taking it apart to use it as a pattern to cut out the pieces of buckram. Then I have my inside head size sort of oval here that I was using as a basis, and this is just based off of, it's freely drawn, but then based off of the measurement around my head. And then I have the side of the hat as well. What is it called? Like the band of the crown, I suppose? You can tell I'm not a fully trained milliner just off the bat because I don't know the correct names for everything. But I'm tracing these paper pieces onto the buckram that I had in stock. This is a heavier weight buckram, or like starched canvas here, that is from several years ago that I bought at Allen's Millinery and Bridal Supplies here in Denver. And I do prefer this heavier weight starched canvas to the other stuff that I have in stock here. I went back to Allen's and they didn't have exactly the same heavier weight of stuff. So I bought something that's a little bit lighter weight, and I ended up using 2 layers of that other stuff for the sides of the hat, or the, what are the sides of the top of the hat? My goodness, I cannot think of the names of these things tonight. Oh no, we're off to a great start, everyone. But just tracing everything I can out of this stiffer buckram, especially the brim I wanted to cut out of this stiffer, thicker hat canvas, or buckram. So I made sure to fit the brim on here, and then the top of the hat fit on here too, but then for the side, I did indeed use the lighter weight stuff and just doubled up. but I can go ahead and cut all this out. I am using my large paper scissors for this, the scissors that I get asked about all the time. Again, these are just like Taylor's paper scissors that I was given my freshman year of university for fashion design, and you can get these at Atlas Levy or other places, and I can link to them in the description below. I get questions about them all the dang time, but they're my paper scissors, so I use them on this canvas as opposed to my fabric scissors, just because this stuff would probably dull my fabric scissors pretty quickly. But I'll cut all this out, and again, I'm just going to cut out 2 layers of this lighter weight stuff, which, This is the first time I've used this particular... It's like, you can see the thread count is higher of this Buckram, but I don't like it as much. At least not yet. I haven't tried using it for wet blocking a hat yet, so maybe I'll like it better for that. If any of you know where I can get that other stuff, the stuff I was using just a second ago, online, do let me know. But after I have my pieces cut out here, I can start setting a few of these things aside and start wiring all the various edges I need to be wiring. So to sew this wire on, I'm going to be using like a blanket stitch, I suppose. I think it's what it's called. Around the edges of the, or to hold the wire down onto the canvas flat here, and then around the edge of the brim as well. But I'm going to wire this inside head size edge first. I'm just using 19 gauge millinery wire for this, and I will use this, I don't know, Coats and Clark thread that's sitting right here. I actually prefer using, you're not supposed to use polyester thread for proper hat making. You're supposed to use cotton or silk thread, of course, and you're only ever supposed to use natural materials, according to my hat teacher, who was very particular about this kind of thing. But I find polyester thread, especially for like theatrical hat making like I'm doing today, as opposed to couture millinery, is very useful because it's very strong. So I can pull on it quite hard and it, retains its strength. Whereas sometimes I get too, I pull too hard on a cotton thread and it'll snap on me. So I do like polyester thread for its strength, that's for sure. And I'm just using red here today because most of the time my stitches won't show in the end, and it will be helpful for you being able to see them here on camera, just because I know my camera is not the best, so picking up what I'm doing is not always easy when it comes to these hatting situations. But I'm just stitching this hat wire down onto the surface of the, what will eventually be the brim of my hat here. The middle of my hat here will eventually be cut away, so you'll see that once we get to that step. But for now, I just am wiring this inside edge, and I just overlap the wires and keep stitching it down. And then after that is on, I can go ahead and wire the brim of my hat here. Now, I really want to take care to wire the brim of my hat because I will eventually be bending this brim a little bit. I do that off camera just because I held the hat up to my head and bent the brim as I wished. So you'll see that later when it goes from having a straight brim to having a bit of a curved brim. All I did was put that over, look at it in the mirror and bend it to the shape I desired. You can't bend it too far unless you cover it in a different way, I suppose. But just covering it, this hat the way I do today, you can give it a little bit of a bend and it'll still work out just fine. But again, I'm just cutting a piece of wire that's long enough that it will overlap a little bit, bending it into shape if needed. And then again, I'm just using blanket stitch to secure this down onto the edge of the brim. I like to have it so that the wire is not right at the edge, but it curls underneath the edge of the brim just a little bit. That's just, I think, a personal choice thing. I don't remember if that was how it's properly done or not. I always say, I'm not a fully trained milliner. This is theatrical hat making, again, not couture. I would love to take more millinery courses in the future, but I'm not a fully trained hat maker, that's for sure. So I'm just doing things in, I guess, a more costumey or slightly slapdash kind of way. Although it is mostly, well, I think all of this hat is hand sewn. I think I use a machine for one bit on the lining and that's it. So it is a mostly hand sewn and handmade hat and all, but it's not up to, I don't know, the Queen's hat maker standards. But now my inner head size and the outside edge of the brim are wired, and I can go ahead and wire the top of the hat tip as well, or the top of the crown, I suppose. And so I'll do that the same way with that blanket stitch again, and then now I can go ahead and cut out the interior of this hat, free it, because I will not need this buckram here in the middle. I just find it easier to do this after I've wired the edges, because the larger piece you have to deal with, well, I guess if you had a really large hat, it could get unwieldy, but at this size, it's kind of nice to have the interior integrity still. And then I will just put slashes every centimeter or so, every half inch or so here inside, because again, eventually this seam allowance will be folded up, and then that's what will be connected to the hat band in the crown. So this area will be folded up eventually. I could have waited to cut this later after I'd covered this. Probably would have been easier, but yeah. For some reason I did it now. A little bit out of order. Because I don't make hats very often, I sometimes do the steps out of order because I'm like, oh yeah, I needed to do this first. But here I am cutting my same paper pattern pieces out of the black cotton duvetine that I used for the accent bits on this carmine gown. So this is the same black cotton duvetine. Again, it looks almost like flannel or like a brushed, yeah, it's a brushed twill is what it is, but it's a bit velvety and almost looks like suede up close, like suede leather. And then in the end, because I covered this hat in it, it almost looks like a blocked wool felt hat, which I'm okay with because cool. It's kind of like a cheating method to get a wool look hat. But for the brim, I did cut out the top in the duvetine and then the underside, the lining of the brim, I suppose, in this bright yellow silk taffeta that I happened to have around here in the studio. I had bought this for another project that didn't end up coming to fruition, so now I just have this yellow taffeta and I'll be using it for this hat today. And I'm cutting a 2-inch wide strip of 45-degree angle, aka bias, from the fabric here as well to use as binding around the edge of my brim, because I will be binding my brim today as well. And luckily this piece fits around this brim almost exactly with like 2 inches to spare, so perfect. I'll go ahead and fold that over on the ironing board into bias tape, double fold bias tape. But I am going to go ahead and just bind this rim with a bit of fusible interfacing as well, just to smooth off any rough edges of the buckram, because it can be quite rough. So I'm just going to go ahead and do this. Of course, no one, again, in couture millinery would use fusible interfacing. I highly doubt. But it's really good and quick at smoothing edges, so works for this more crafty kind of hat for sure. So I'm just doing that quickly over here, and it just smooths off any of the stitching and the rough edges from that buckram. Done. I can bring that back over to the blue table and then start layering up my fabric here. So I'm putting the black on the top and the yellow on the bottom, and I'll just pin this in place. Again, I like to put pins at like north, south, east, and west here, 4 corners of this first, and then fill in between, just to make sure everything is in the correct spot, not getting stretched or warped in a weird way. And I am using some very fine pins for this, and I'm kind of intending that they will get bent. I kind of know I'm sacrificing them to the hat gods, as it were. But here again, I'm just grabbing some of that same Coats & Clark thread so I can stitch this on around the outside edge. I'm just going to use like a kind of a weird back stitch to do this. And again, you don't have to make your stitches too tiny for this, because again, it's going to be completely covered up. So it's more about the structure when it comes to these stitches than it is about the look, because none of these stitches will eventually be seen, which is why I'm using red thread as well, because none of it will be seen in the end. So I'm just going around the edge here with kind of a strange back stitch, backwards back stitch, almost like this is like the reverse side of what back stitch normally looks like. You know, I just, especially with this hat, I was trying to make this, you know, quickly as opposed to perfectly. Perfect can sometimes be, you know, the enemy of done, as they say. So, but here I am covering up that stitching with that bias binding I was talking about. And this is how I was taught to cover a brim, well, sort of, a little bit nicer than this, but using the 2 layers on the top and bottom, and then the binding was how I was taught to cover a brim of a buckram hat like this when I was in millinery class. So modifying some of the techniques I did learn, although I did accidentally buy polyester taffeta because the man at Shepherd's Bush told me that it was real silk, and I believed him because I didn't know that much about textiles back then, and then my hat teacher was very disappointed in me for buying polyester fabric for my project as opposed to real silk. But that was before I knew how to feel the difference, and sometimes fabric merchants in like textile districts as opposed to like online, well, I'm sure people sometimes lie online too actually, but sometimes people will try and sell you stuff and tell you it's one thing when it's definitely not. And this is why it's good to like say, oh cool, can I have a swatch then, and go outside, take a match or a lighter to it and do a burn test and see if they're telling the truth before you pay 24 pounds a yard or whatever I paid for not real silk. But this actual real silk taffeta from Silk Baron here is doing its job marvelously of stretching around the curved brim of my hat here. I'm just pinning it in place on both sides, and then I will slip stitch this down both on the top and then on the inside by hand. But yeah, I definitely got sold polyester, being told it was silk when I was studying in London. Whoops. Should have just paid, you know, even a little bit more over on Regent Street, where the store was like called Silk something, so like everything they sold was silk. And I could have been 100% sure. I think I was looking for a very particular color. I wanted like lavender for some reason. I wanted to make like a Marie Antoinette, the film, kind of inspired hat. And my teacher was like, oh, really? She was a very judgy person, but had like, again, worked with Vivienne Westwood and Jean Paul Gaultier and like really fancy people, and had learned traditional millinery from like someone who had made hats for the Queen Mother, so like was very official. So I guess she had earned the right to be kind of judgy. I don't know. She was a very nice lady, but you could tell when she was like, "Oy," with us American students, transfer students, or international students, I suppose. It was a very fun class. It was interesting because everyone got to make whatever style of hat they wanted. So like there was only, I don't know, maybe 12, 14 people in the class, and everyone chose what style of hat they wanted to make. And so like your neighbor at your table might be making a completely different style of hat than you, and you could kind of listen to how that hat was made while you were waiting for the teacher to help you with yours. And it was interesting for sure that how that class was kind of run, because you did pick up things from the other hats that were being made in the room. But yes, here I am slip stitching the back as well. I've switched over to actually proper cotton thread for this, taking a little stitch out of the fold of the bias tape and then a stitch down into the fabric along the brim and just going all the way around. This silk taffeta is, you know, crisp and nice, so I probably should have done a layer of something underneath that taffeta too, just to make sure that because it's a little bit transparent, you can kind of see the buckram underneath it, the pattern of the buckram underneath it, if you look really closely. Here I am test fitting the band and the tip onto the brim and into each other, I suppose. And so I'm just test fitting that. Again, I've cut the tip every centimeter just like I had the brim so that it fits down in here. You can kind of see how these things start to go together. It's really, really good to mock these things up on paper. So if you're making hats like this, cut and sew buckram and wired hats, I really recommend making them out of construction paper or poster board first to get an idea of exactly what you want before you start working in buckram. But now that I have this sized and pinned to fit, I'm just going to sew this band together while this is pinned to the brim, just so that I can be very sure of the size. And again, I'm just using backstitch to do this, and I'm going to like make a little window here. I'm going to go up across a little bit and then back down along the overlap here, just so that this is secured. Again, is this the official way to do this? No, but it's the way that I did it for this particular hat. So, you know, there's that. But once I had the band size secured, I went ahead and grabbed another piece of double thread here, knotted that, and fit, again, the tip into the band. And I just started trying to figure out how to pin that best, which was not that way. Here we go. Try again from the top, literally and figuratively. But I like to pin at a 45-degree angle whenever connecting things like this. Again, you know, this is not... I really feel bad about my millinery because it just doesn't seem up to the level that I would like it to be, I guess. But we are all our own worst critics, are we not? So, thus, you know, I'm a learner. I'm not an experienced milliner yet, but one day I would love to take more courses, especially to do more blocked hats as well, and to advance my millinery technique. I feel bad, you know, passing on bad technique, I guess, is what I'm feeling guilty about here. But again, do as I say sometimes, not as I do. But now that I have this tip pinned onto the top of the crown here, I'm just stitching through the little tabs to connect this to the band. And again, I'm using spaced backstitch. Well, overlapping backstitch, I guess. Ooh, once again, me and my hand stitching terms. I really should just look it up and study it so I know from the future. I'm just doing things by feel, you know, and then I have to go back and explain them, as I always say. And I'm like, ooh, when it comes to watching these. But I just go all the way around the top to secure that down. And because this rougher buckram is meeting this soft buckram, I kind of want to smooth this out. So I've shown this technique here on the channel before, I believe, where you take a tiny bit of water and you just brush it over the seam and then like burnish it with your iron. So you kind of press it down with your iron to smooth off the seam between the two different types of buckram here, but usually it would be the same type of buckram at least. But it just, the water activates the sizing in this material just a tiny bit. It doesn't get stuck to the iron or anything before. Someone has asked me that one before. If it gets onto the iron, you're only activating a tiny bit of the glue in this stuff. And then I'm just going to finish that off and really smooth things off with another bit of fusible interfacing. This is super lightweight fusible, by the way. That's all I have in stock right now anyhow. But I'm just going to go over this area and really smooth this off. I'm not sure if you're supposed to have the tabs on the outside of the stand like this or on the inside. I don't remember. It's been too long. My hat making class was in 2012, so I don't really remember. I should have taken better notes. I'm sure I have a notebook somewhere from that class, but in the moving back home from college, who knows where that has ended up. I haven't seen it down here in the sewing room, so I'm not sure if I have that notebook still, which is a big bummer. But this worked, at least for this hat today. But now that everything is smoothed off on the top of my crown here, I can go ahead and start covering this piece as well before I put the two together. When I'm making a pillbox, because it's a brimless hat, aka just like the crown, like the tip and the band, I usually cover both pieces after I sew them together. But because I'm using almost like a big pillbox, actually it looks kind of like a fez, and then sewing it onto the brim, I will cover each separately. So the brim is all done, sitting there waiting, and I will go ahead and cover this tip and side band before I put it onto the brim, obviously. Ooh. But after I have that stitched around again with backstitch a little bit down from the tip, which will be covered in a moment, I can go ahead and cover the side of this hat. I'm just folding the top of the fabric piece that matches the buckram piece that will be underneath down 1/2 inch. I'm just winding that folded edge around, just covering the stitching that I just did to sew the tip cover on. And then where this meets down the back seam, I will just fold everything smooth and under and pin it in place to size so that everything is smooth and covered. And then I will just slip stitch the top folded edge down and then down the side as well. And then I would just stab stitch the inside folded down inside here. So you've seen me cover a hat before in that pillbox video, so I will link to that here as well, so you can have another further reference for that. And I can put actually my different ways of covering a hat crown from my blog, my old blogging days, in the description below as well. But now that the brim is covered and the crown are covered, I can connect them again using those little cut tabs here. And again, I'm just stab stitching these together. So it's like a running stitch, but a little bit longer stitch on the inside than the outside. But once they are together, I tried this on and I bent the brim a little bit, like I was mentioning earlier. And now I get to decide how to trim this hat. So I'm just pinning my trimmings on for now. I'm just sewing this feather into a funny loop here, because why not? When it comes to these Victorian hats, you really can pile on the tat on top of them. Victorians love a lot of feathers, birds, even entire birds. This is before we had made several birds extinct by doing this. But these are just some ostrich feathers here. And you can see I have various things in the background. I've got peacock feathers, I've got a fake bird, I've got lace, I've got ribbon, I've got little tiny pumpkins, which I didn't end up using this time, which is a shame because I was rather excited about the idea of possibly putting tiny pumpkins on my hat. I'll have to make another pumpkin-themed hat sometime because, I mean, the opportunity is just too good. But here I'm just arranging a bunch of feathers on here because, let's face it, I love feathers. But I'm pinning them in place, and then I'll try the hat on and see if I like it, rearrange things if needed, and then finalize what and where I want my trimmings to be. And this hat is not lined yet, and that is because when I stitch these trimmings on, the stitches will be on the inside and messy, and I want to cover that all up with lining eventually, as opposed to having those stitches be on my lining and kind of marring the inside. And I decided I want to use a little bit more of this yellow silk, perhaps. But after I had held everything up to my head and decided where I wanted everything to be finally placed, I just went ahead and stitched things on right through the buckram of the hat. Just a few stitches to anchor my feathers onto the hat so that they wouldn't go flying away off of my hat anytime. Like so. And then I can stitch on the other black feathers, like a band of feathers that I'm going to be stitching on here. These black feathers here, I'm not really sure where those came from. Someone sent me some feathers one time. I think that's where these came from. I think they were a gift. But you can see the messy stitches on the inside of this hat, and that's why you sew your trimmings on before you do your lining. And if you ever need to take the trimmings off, you can always just take out the lining, take the trimmings off, and put the lining back in. It's not that big of an operation. But this black spray of feathers I'm putting on here is from Petersham's, the hat making supply shop in the UK. I haven't placed an order with them in a long time because international shipping during COVID, not really dealing with it. So I'm not ordering anything from abroad currently, but I do like Petersham's for hat making. There's a lot more hat making supply shops in the UK, of course, because people in the UK still wear hats compared to here in the US where people don't really wear hats. And I just kind of temporarily stuck these red feathers in here. I didn't stitch them on, I just kind of zhuzhed them in here because it matches this carmine gown, but I think I want to keep this hat, like the permanent trimmings that are sewn on, just black and yellow, in case I want to wear this hat with a different gown in the future, which was done at the time. A lot of times people didn't have hats that matched each costume in their collection, or each of their outfits. They had hats that would match a couple things because it's much more economical that way, of course. So this hat probably would have been worn with black gowns, with yellow gowns, with other things that those would coordinate with, etc., etc. But I'm cutting a nice 3-inch wide piece of bias again from my yellow silk, and I'm going to cut this to have a bit of a dagged edge, just for a kind of Halloween touch here, and then I'll tack this ribbon on as well, or pin it into place, and then decide exactly how I want it on this hat, and then I will tack it into place again with a few stitches. So that's what I'm doing here. Kind of made it into a funny looking weird bow in the front, and then I'm just like folding little pleats into it to create this little puffs, like flower-like kind of puffs. Almost reminds me, this hat almost reminds me of like a quote-unquote pilgrim style hat almost. I feel like it would work for like the 1600s as well. I don't know why it like almost looks like a 17th century hat to me. I also feel like this hat would look pretty okay for Regency stuff. It's actually quite versatile, perhaps. Not that I would ever make a Regency costume, because me and Empire waisted things, it's a no. And here you see I've wrapped tape around my finger to work as a lint roller here for where my dagged edge is shedding. I probably should have cut that with pinking shears. Would have been a much better idea. Cut large pinks with pinking shears. Probably would look cuter too. Maybe I'll do another ribbon in the future, because this is just tacked on. It'll be easy to remove. But I was liking the look of these fun pointy situation going on. I went to go try it on one more time before I finalize that, and then I'll just tack those bits on as well. But as you are watching this video, I am actually on a bit of a work vacation, a combo, because I'll be vlogging my way across part of the United States, because I'll be driving from here in Colorado to California and back on a large, grand adventure, huge road trip, the biggest trip, and especially the biggest solo trip I've ever been on. So hopefully I don't know, driving through Utah right now or something like that. Who knows where I am as you're listening to me. I could be anywhere. I mean, if I looked at my itinerary, I would be able to tell you, but I'm out and about in the world, but keeping to myself at the same time. And as we know, I'm fully vaccinated, so hopefully between my tendency to social distance no matter what, and the fact that I'll be traveling alone in my car, everything will be okay. Mostly I'm going to go out and see, like, you know, the nature, which is very strange. But here I am cutting out the band and tip pieces again from the taffeta once more to line this hat, which, wow, what a luxurious lining. Cotton duvetine on the outside, silk taffeta on the inside. I wouldn't mind using the rest of this silk taffeta to make another bonnet or hat, because it is kind of divine. We all know how I love yellow and how I love silk taffeta, so this stuff is quite delicious. I wouldn't mind having, you know, 15 more yards of this to make a gown out of sometime, because, oof. But I'm just pinning the band around the circle of the tip, and then this is the only thing I will machine stitch for this hat. Comes out looking a bit like this. I didn't even close up that band. I'm just going to fold it closed in here. It'll be fine. But I'm sticking the lining into the hat now, folding over, or folding in to the interior between the hat and the lining, the seam allowance. Hopefully you can see what I mean. You know what I mean? I'm folding the top edge of this inside to the hat, and then I'm stitching everything down. I'm just going to actually fell this down along this edge here. This is the only like hand stitching that may be seen, so you could slip stitch it if you have a curved needle, would help with that too. And I know a lot of you are like, oh my goodness, why isn't she using a thimble for all of this? And I find thimbles cumbersome. I'm not used to using them, and I don't like them, so I just use my calloused little fingers to do everything. But that is just hand felled all along the edge in there, and then I sewed in one of my B labels into the bottom of the hat here. And then I'm one last lint rolling of a time, and my hat was ready to wear. And I did use 2 hat pins to secure this hat. It stays on pretty well, but I wouldn't trust it with any wind. Again, this hat could be about a ½ inch bigger, and it would have, I don't think I would have had to use a hat pin if I had made this just a little bit bigger, so it would slide down onto my head a little bit further. But that is my hat, all completed and done and ready to be worn. And here is my finished hat, the one that you have sort of seen already, but here it is in its completed, being worn glory, with a little bit more detail perhaps, a little bit more light on the subject outside. I'm very happy with this hat. Perhaps sometime I'll just wear it with a black 1940s suit, because that would be kind of extra and rather fun. I hope you have enjoyed this short little mini-series for the carmine gown, and thank you as always for watching this video today. I'll be back with more vintage fashion, sewing, and pattern drafting, of course, real soon, and I will see you then. Bye! An extra special thanks to Alice, Che, Karina, Denise, Ellen, Eloquent Silence, Carol, Lynn, Margaret, Maria, Nancy, Rachamus, Rhonda, Swingularity, Tom, and Tracy for making this costume and my channel possible. Thank you to all of my patrons and all of you who support me here on the channel. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you again soon.